Welcome to Sleepless Philosophers. Before the ideas begin, a small request: most of you who watch are not subscribed, and we've noticed this in the numbers, in the gap between views and the audience that stays. We post every single day, we put care into each script, each thought, each question that unfolds in the dark, and if these videos have become part of your nights, if they help you think or drift, or simply exist in that space between waking and sleep, consider subscribing, hitting the like button, turning on notifications so you know when the next one arrives. And if you feel moved to do so, leave a comment, tell us where you're watching from. What philosophical question occupies your mind the most? What idea you return to when everything else falls away? These small gestures matter more than you might think. They allow this work to continue. They allow these ideas to reach others like you, scattered across the world, awake in the quiet hours. Now the introduction ends and the philosophy begins. Putnam sat in a room and imagined two planets, identical in every way, except one, Earth and twin Earth, perfect mirrors of each other, down to the last atom, the last thought, the last whispered word. And on Earth there is water, H2O, the molecule that makes up oceans and rivers and rain. And on twin Earth there is also water, but it is not H2O. It is XYZ, a completely different substance with different chemical structure, different molecular bonds, different properties at the microscopic level. Yet to everyone living on twin Earth it looks exactly like water, tastes exactly like water, behaves exactly like water. It fills their lakes and falls from their clouds and quenches their thirst just as water does on Earth. Now imagine two people, one on Earth and one on twin Earth. Call them both Oscar. And these two Oscars are molecule for molecule identical. Same brain structure, same neural patterns, same memories, same thoughts, same internal psychological states. Everything inside their heads is exactly the same. And both Oscars look at a glass of liquid and say the word water. They both think they are referring to the same thing. They both believe they know what water is, but Putnam asks a simple question that shatters centuries of philosophy. Are they actually referring to the same thing? And the answer is no. Earth Oscar's word water refers to H2O. Twin Earth Oscar's word water refers to XYZ. Same word, same internal mental state, but different meanings, different references, different extensions in the world. And this means that meaning is not determined by what is in the head. Meaning is not a function of internal psychological states. Meaning is not private, not subjective, not locked inside the skull waiting to be discovered through introspection. The tradition, before Putnam, stretching back through Locke and Hume and Descartes, believed that meanings were mental entities, that words were connected to ideas in the mind, that reference was mediated by internal representations, by concepts, by mental images, and if you wanted to know what someone meant by a word, you had to look inside their head, examine their thoughts, map their mental contents, and this made sense, it felt right. It aligned with the intuition that language is personal, that each person has their own private understanding of words, their own associations, their own mental dictionary. But Putnam showed that this entire picture was wrong, that two people could have identical mental contents and still mean different things by the same word. That meaning reaches beyond the skull, beyond the brain, beyond psychology entirely, into the world itself, into the environment, into the physical and social context that determines what words actually refer to. This is semantic externalism, the view that meanings are not in the head but out in the world. That reference is determined not by internal states but by external relations, by causal connections between words and things, by the history of how a word came to be used, by the community of speakers who share the word, by the natural kinds that exist independently of human thought. And this means that you can be wrong about what you mean. You can use a word your entire life and not know what it really refers to. You can have perfect confidence in your understanding and still be completely mistaken, because meaning is not something you possess. It is something you participate in, something that exists in the space between speakers and world, between language and reality, between words and the things they pick out. Putnam's argument did not stop at Twin Earth. He pushed further. He talked about the division of linguistic labour, the fact that most people do not know the technical details of what their words refer to. Most people cannot define gold in terms of atomic number, cannot distinguish an elm from a beech, cannot explain what makes aluminum different from molybdenum. Yet they use these words successfully. They refer to these things accurately, and they do so not because they have the right mental contents, but because they are embedded in a community where some people do have the expertise, where metallurgists know about aluminum, where botanists know about elms, where chemists know about gold. And when ordinary speakers use these words, they defer to the experts. They rely on the division of labour. They trust that somewhere in the linguistic community, there are people who know what these words really mean, who can distinguish the real thing from the fake. And this trust is what allows language to function, what allows reference to succeed even in the absence of individual knowledge. This overturns the Cartesian picture entirely. Descartes believed that knowledge began with the self, with the contents of consciousness, with what could be known through introspection, and from there one built outward to knowledge of the world. But Putnam showed that the order is reversed, that knowledge of meaning requires knowledge of the world first, that you cannot know what you mean without knowing what your words refer to, and you cannot know what your words refer to just by looking inside your own mind. You have to look outside to the physical environment, to the social context, to the history of usage, to the experts who maintain the standards of reference. And this means that the self is not the foundation of knowledge, but a participant in a larger system, a node in a network of linguistic and social relations that determine meaning collectively, not individually, externally, not internally. Frege tried to solve the problem of meaning differently. He distinguished between sense and reference, between the mode of presentation and the thing presented, and he believed that sense was in the mind, that it mediated reference, that two people could refer to the same thing through different senses, like the morning star and the evening star, both referring to Venus, and this preserved the idea that meaning had a mental component, that internal states mattered. But Putnam's argument cut through this because on Twin Earth, Oscar and his counterpart have the same sense, the same mode of presentation, the same mental mediation, but they do not have the same reference. They are not talking about the same substance, and this means that sense alone does not determine reference, that no amount of mental content can fix what a word picks out in the world, that reference requires something beyond sense, beyond psychology, beyond anything that can be captured by introspection or phenomenology. Kripke reinforced this from another angle. He argued that names and natural kind terms were rigid designators, that they referred to the same thing in all possible worlds, not by virtue of satisfying a description, but by virtue of causal historical chains, that the word water refers to H2O because it was introduced to refer to a certain substance, and that reference was passed down through generations of speakers, through baptism and transmission, through ostension and use. And even if speakers lost track of what the substance was, even if they forgot its chemical composition, even if they developed false beliefs about it, the words still referred to the same thing, because reference is not determined by beliefs but by the causal connection between word and world, by the chain that links current usage back to the original act of naming, back to the moment when the word was first attached to the thing. This has radical implications for psychology, because it means psychology cannot determine reference, cannot tell you what your words mean, cannot give you the extension of your terms just by examining your mental states. And this was a blow to cognitive science, to theories of mind that tried to explain language purely in terms of internal representations, in terms of concepts and mental models and computational processes, because Putnam and Kripke showed that none of this is enough. That meaning leaks out of the head, that it requires the world, requires the community, requires the causal historical context. And without these external factors, there is no meaning at all. Just empty sounds, just syntax without semantics, just symbols shuffling around inside the skull with no connection to reality. Yet people resist this conclusion. They cling to the intuition that they know what they mean, that their words are transparent to them. That meaning is something they possess and control. And this resistance is understandable because semantic externalism is deeply unsettling. It suggests that we are strangers to our own language, that we do not fully understand the words we speak, that meaning is not something we create, but something we inherit, something we are thrown into, something that precedes us and exceeds us and determines what we can say before we even open our mouths. Wittgenstein saw this too, though from a different direction. He argued that meaning is use, that words get their meaning from the language games they are embedded in, from the forms of life that give them context. And he rejected the idea of private language, the idea that meaning could be purely internal, purely subjective, because a private language would have no standards of correctness, no way to distinguish between following a rule and merely thinking one is following a rule. And without standards, there is no meaning, just the illusion of meaning, just the feeling of understanding without actual understanding. And this is why language must be public, why it must be shared, why it requires a community of speakers who can correct each other, who can point out mistakes, who can maintain the norms that make reference possible. Putnam took this further. He showed not just that language is public, but that meaning is not even fully determined by the community, that it reaches beyond the community into the world itself, that natural kind terms like water and gold and tiger refer to whatever has the same underlying nature as the paradigm samples, the same deep structure, the same essential properties, and this means that meaning can outrun knowledge, that a community can use a word correctly even when they have false beliefs about what they are referring to, even when their theories are wrong, even when their understanding is incomplete, because the word latches onto the real essence, the objective structure, the natural kind that exists independently of human thought. And the world itself constrains meaning, corrects mistakes, determines reference in ways that no internal psychological state can capture. This is why Aristotle was not wrong when he talked about water, even though he did not know about molecules, even though his theory of elements was false. He was still referring to H2O because his word water was causally connected to the same substance our word water refers to, because the reference was fixed not by his beliefs, but by the stuff itself, by the samples he pointed to, by the liquid he drank and swam in and observed, and the continuity of reference across theory change, across conceptual revolutions, across the abandonment of entire frameworks, shows that meaning is anchored in the world, not in the mind, that it survives the death of theories because it was never dependent on theories in the first place. But this raises a puzzle. If meaning is not in the head, if psychological states do not determine reference, then what role does the mind play at all? What is psychology supposed to study if not meaning, if not the contents of thought, if not the representations that mediate between language and world? And Putnam's answer is that psychology studies something real. It studies mental states. It studies computational processes. It studies the functional organization of cognition, but it does not study meaning, because meaning is not a psychological phenomenon. It is a semantic phenomenon. It is a relation between words and world, between signs and reference, between language and reality, and this relation is not mediated by anything in the head. It is direct. It is external. It is constituted by causal and social factors that lie beyond the reach of introspection, beyond the scope of neuroscience, beyond the explanatory power of any psychological theory. Fodor resisted this. He wanted to preserve a role for internal content, for narrow content, for something in the head that could do explanatory work, and he argued that even if meaning is wide, even if reference is external, there must be something narrow that explains behaviour, some internal state that mediates between input and output, some mental representation that the cognitive system manipulates. And he tried to carve out a space for psychology by distinguishing between wide content, which depends on the environment, and narrow content, which does not, which is purely internal, purely psychological, purely computational. But this move was always unstable because narrow content turned out to be elusive, hard to define, hard to individuate, hard to see how it could play the explanatory role Fodor wanted it to play. And many philosophers concluded that narrow content was a myth, that there was no such thing, that all content was wide, that meaning was always externalist, always dependent on factors beyond the head, and if psychology wanted to explain behaviour, it would have to appeal to wide content, to states that are individuated by their relations to the environment, to representations that are only representations in virtue of their connections to what they represent. This is deeply counterintuitive, because it means that two people in identical internal states could be thinking different thoughts, could be believing different things, could be referring to different objects, just because they are in different environments, just because their words have different causal histories, just because the world around them is structured differently. And this seems to violate the intuition that mental states are internal, that what you're thinking is determined by what is going on inside your head, that consciousness is private, that the contents of experience are immediately accessible to introspection. But Putnam and Kripke showed that this intuition is wrong, that mental states are not self-intimating, that you can be mistaken about what you're thinking, that the meanings of your thoughts depend on facts about the world that you may not know, that reference is opaque, that you can use words successfully without understanding what they mean, that language works not because speakers have perfect knowledge, but because they are embedded in networks of reference that do the work for them, that connect words to things through mechanisms that operate below the level of consciousness, below the level of intentional control. Burge extended this argument to mental content itself. He argued that not just linguistic meaning, but thought itself is individuated externally, that beliefs and desires are identified by their relations to the environment, that you could not have a belief about water if you lived in a world with no water, that mental content is essentially relational, essentially dependent on what exists outside the mind, and this means that the mind is not a self-contained system, not a module that could be studied in isolation, not a computational device that processes inputs according to internal rules, but an open system, a system that is constituted by its interactions with the world, that is shaped by its environment, that cannot be understood without reference to the physical and social context it is embedded in. This has implications for artificial intelligence, for the question of whether machines can think, because if meaning is external, if reference depends on causal historical connections, if mental content is individuated by relations to the environment, then a computer program, no matter how sophisticated, cannot have genuine thoughts unless it has the right connections to the world, unless it is embedded in the right kind of causal network, unless it participates in the same linguistic and social practices that give human words their meanings. And this suggests that thought is not just computation, not just symbol manipulation, not just syntactic operations on formal structures, but something that requires embodiment, requires situatedness, requires participation in a form of life, and a brain in a vat, no matter how complex its internal processes, would not be thinking about water or trees or anything else, because its words would not be connected to anything, would not refer to anything, would be empty symbols with no semantic content, no meaning, no reference, just syntax running in a void. Putnam himself later came to doubt some of his own arguments. He worried that semantic externalism led to metaphysical realism, to the view that there is a fixed, determinate way the world is, independent of human conceptual schemes, independent of language, independent of theory, and he came to think this was incoherent, that it made reference magical, that it required a God's eye view, a perspective from nowhere that could compare words to things without being situated in any particular framework, and he moved toward internal realism, toward the view that truth and reference are always relative to a conceptual scheme, always dependent on the practices and norms of a community, always constrained by what Quine called the tribunal of experience, but never fully determined by it. And this introduced a tension, a pull between the external world that constrains reference and the internal practices that constitute meaning, a tension that Putnam never fully resolved, that perhaps cannot be resolved, because meaning lives in that tension, in the space between mind and world, between language and reality, between what we intend and what our words actually pick out. Dennett approached this from yet another angle. He argued that meaning is not a real property but a useful fiction, that intentional states are not natural kinds but interpretive stances, that when we attribute beliefs and desires, we are not discovering facts about the mind but adopting a strategy for predicting behaviour. And from this perspective, the question of whether meaning is in the head or in the world dissolves. Because meaning is not anywhere, it is not a real thing but a pattern we impose, a way of organising our understanding of complex systems. And the intentional stance works whether we apply it to humans or thermostats or chess programs. The difference is just pragmatic, just a matter of what level of description is most useful for prediction and explanation. Not a matter of what really has meaning and what does not, because nothing really has meaning. Meaning is always an interpretation, always a projection, always a way of seeing that could be otherwise. But this seems too deflationary, too quick to dismiss the felt reality of meaning, the undeniable sense that words do connect to things, that thoughts are about the world. That reference is not just a useful fiction but a real relation, and even if we cannot fully explain how this relation works, even if semantic externalism leaves gaps and puzzles, it at least takes seriously the intuition that language matters, that what we say makes a difference, that truth is not just coherence within a system but correspondence with reality, however elusive and problematic that correspondence may be. And to give up on this, to reduce meaning to a mere interpretive stance, feels like giving up on something essential, something worth preserving even if we cannot fully explain it, even if it leads to paradoxes and tensions that resist resolution. Because the alternative is a world where nothing means anything, where language floats free of reality, where thought is cut loose from the world, and that is a world too empty, too barren, too divorced from lived experience to be acceptable, even if it is theoretically cleaner, even if it avoids the hard problems, even if it makes philosophy easier by making meaning disappear. The Buddhists arrived at similar conclusions through a different route, through meditation rather than metaphysics, through direct observation of the mind rather than philosophical system building, and the first noble truth of Buddhism is dukkha, often translated as suffering, but more accurately rendered as unsatisfactoriness, as the pervasive quality of experience being not quite right, not quite enough, always slightly off. And dukkha is not just pain in the obvious sense, not just sickness and aging and death, though it includes those, but also the subtler suffering that pervades even pleasant experiences. The suffering of impermanence, the knowledge that this good thing will end, the clinging to what is passing, the aversion to what is arriving, and the Buddha taught that dukkha arises from tanha, from craving, from thirst, from the insatiable wanting that drives all beings. And this wanting takes three forms: wanting to get pleasant experiences, wanting to get rid of unpleasant experiences, and wanting to exist or not exist, to be or not to be. And all three forms are doomed to frustration because pleasant experiences are temporary, Unpleasant experiences are inevitable, and existence itself is impermanent, and so the structure of suffering is built into the structure of desire, is unavoidable as long as desire persists. And the path to liberation is not through satisfying desire, which is impossible, but through extinguishing desire, through seeing clearly that the objects of desire are empty, are incapable of providing lasting satisfaction. And through this seeing, the craving naturally falls away, naturally releases its grip, and what remains is peace, is nirvana, is the end of suffering. But this end is not a state of pleasure, is not happiness in the ordinary sense, is more like the absence of disturbance, the cessation of the constant churning that characterizes normal consciousness. And the question is whether this cessation is desirable, whether a life without desire is a life worth living, whether the price of ending suffering is too high if it requires giving up the very things that make life feel meaningful, the projects and relationships and ambitions that depend on caring about outcomes, on wanting things to be a certain way. And different Buddhist traditions answer this question differently, some emphasizing renunciation and withdrawal, others emphasizing engagement and compassion, but all agree that the root problem is structural, is in the nature of consciousness itself, is not something that can be fixed through better circumstances or better choices, but only through a fundamental transformation of how experience is related to, how the self is understood, how the mind works. Modern psychology has discovered what it calls hedonic adaptation, the process by which humans return to a baseline level of happiness, regardless of changes in life circumstances. And the research shows that people who win the lottery, after an initial spike of euphoria, return within months to approximately the same level of life satisfaction they had before winning. And people who become paralyzed after the initial devastation adapt and return to a level of happiness that is lower than before, but not as low as would be predicted. Not as low as most people imagine it would be. And this adaptation is a survival mechanism. It is necessary because if organisms could be permanently satisfied by achieving a goal, then they would stop striving, would stop seeking food and mates and safety, and would not survive. And so the brain is built to habituate, to normalize, to take whatever is and make it the new baseline. And this means that the pursuit of happiness, through achievement, through acquisition, through changing external circumstances, is structurally doomed, is chasing a horizon that recedes at the same rate it is approached, because the happiness is not in the circumstances, but in the change, in the contrast, in the movement from worse to better. And once the better becomes normal, it is no longer better. It is just the new normal, and new desires emerge, new dissatisfactions appear, and the hedonic treadmill keeps turning, keeps demanding more effort to stay in the same place. And the only ones who escape this treadmill are those who stop running, who step off, who find a way to want what they have rather than having what they want. But this stepping off is difficult, is counter to every instinct, is fighting against the architecture that makes humans what they are, and most people never manage it, spend entire lives running and never arriving, and die still wanting, still believing that the next thing will be the thing that finally brings peace. And this belief is necessary for the machinery to function, is the fuel that keeps the engine running. And natural selection has no interest in whether organisms are happy, only in whether they reproduce. And happiness is useful only insofar as it motivates behavior that leads to reproduction. And beyond that utility, it is irrelevant, is waste, is not optimized for. And so the baseline is set low, is set to chronic mild dissatisfaction, because that is what motivates, what drives action, what keeps organisms alive long enough to pass genes forward. The problem of evil has troubled theologians for millennia. The question of how a benevolent and omnipotent God could allow suffering to exist. And the traditional answers involve free will, involve the necessity of moral growth through adversity, involve the incomprehensibility of divine plans. But these answers satisfy fewer and fewer people as the scale of suffering becomes visible, as the recognition spreads that most suffering is not ennobling, does not lead to growth, does not serve any purpose that a benevolent designer would endorse, that children die of disease, that animals are eaten alive, that entire populations are wiped out by earthquakes and floods and famines that have nothing to do with human choice, nothing to do with moral development, nothing to do with anything except the cold mechanics of a universe that is indifferent to pain. And the philosopher David Hume argued that the presence of suffering is evidence against the existence of a benevolent God, that no parent would design a world like this for their children, that the amount and distribution of pain suggests either that there is no designer or that the designer is not good, is not worthy of worship, and Hume's argument has never been adequately answered, has only been evaded through appeals to mystery, through claims that human reason is insufficient to judge divine purposes. But this evasion is itself an admission of defeat, an acknowledgement that the problem is real and the reconciliation is impossible. And so the theological framework collapses under the weight of suffering, leaves only the question of how to bear existence without the consolation of cosmic justice, without the belief that pain serves a purpose, without the hope that somewhere, somehow, the scales will balance and the answer might be that there is no answer, that suffering does not mean anything, does not point toward anything, is just the cost of nervous systems, the price of being organized in a way that allows for sensation. And that consciousness, that awareness of the gap between what is and what could be, amplifies this suffering, makes it not just physical, but existential, not just sensation, but meaning, not just pain, but the knowledge of pain, the memory of pain, the anticipation of future pain. And this knowledge makes human suffering unique, makes it worse than animal suffering. Not because the pain is more intense, but because it is reflected upon, is integrated into narrative, becomes part of identity, becomes something that the self must carry and interpret and explain. And the explanations are usually lies, are usually stories about deserving or learning or cosmic balance. And these lies are necessary, are what make continued existence tolerable. But they are still lies, and occasionally the lies fail. Occasionally the truth breaks through. And what is seen in those moments is the naked architecture, the structure of suffering that underlies everything. And this seeing is what mystics call enlightenment, and what others call depression. And perhaps these are not opposites, but the same recognition, interpreted through different frameworks, the same glimpse of the machinery, with different conclusions about what to do with the knowledge. Schopenhauer believed that the only legitimate response to this recognition is compassion, because once it is understood that all beings are expressions of the same will, that suffering is universal, that the appearance of separation between self and other is illusion, then harming another is revealed to be harming oneself, and the natural response is to minimize suffering wherever possible, to extend kindness not because it will be rewarded, but because the boundaries between beings are not as solid as they appear, and this compassion is not sentimental, is not based on hope or optimism, is based on the clear-eyed recognition that existence is shared burden, that everyone is trapped in the same machinery, and that the only response that makes sense is to reduce the load where possible, to offer relief where available, to acknowledge the suffering rather than deny it. And Schopenhauer saw art and philosophy as temporary escapes, as moments where the will is briefly quieted, where awareness can contemplate form without desire, can appreciate beauty without wanting to possess it, can think about truth without needing to use it. And these moments are rare, are fragile, are always interrupted by the return of willing, but they offer proof that another mode of existence is possible, that the machinery can be paused, that the architecture of suffering does not have to be the only architecture, even if it is the dominant one, even if it is the one that shapes most of life, most of the time. And the question is whether these moments justify the rest, whether the brief respites are worth the long stretches of striving and failing and suffering. And Schopenhauer himself was unsure, oscillated between affirmation and negation, between the beauty of the world and the horror of the world. And perhaps this oscillation is the only honest response, the only way to hold both truths simultaneously, that life is terrible and life is precious, that suffering is structural and moments of peace are real, that the architecture cannot be dismantled, but occasionally there are rooms within it where the walls fall away and something else becomes visible, something that is not suffering, not pleasure, but simply presence, simply the fact of being without the overlay, of wanting or not wanting. And these moments do not solve the problem, do not justify the design, but they complicate it, make it less simple than pure pessimism would suggest, make it possible to continue even without hope, even without the belief that things will get better. Because better is not the point. The point is just this, just the strange fact of consciousness, of awareness watching itself struggle, and occasionally, inexplicably, finding in that struggle something that cannot quite be called good, but also cannot be called entirely bad, something that is just what it is, just the texture of existence itself, neither endorsed nor rejected, but simply witnessed. And in that witnessing, there is a kind of freedom. Not freedom from suffering, but freedom within it. Freedom to see it clearly, to understand the architecture, to know the machinery, and to choose not whether to suffer, because that is not a choice, but how to suffer. With resistance or acceptance, with bitterness or grace, with isolation or connection. And these choices do not change the structure, but they change the experience of living within the structure. And perhaps that is all that can be changed. Perhaps that is enough, or perhaps it is not enough. Perhaps nothing is enough. Perhaps the architecture guarantees that enough will never arrive, that satisfaction will always be temporary, that the next moment will bring new wanting, new suffering, new proof that the baseline cannot be permanently altered. And this might be the final truth, the one that cannot be evaded or consoled, that existence is structured to hurt, that pain is not accidental but essential, and that knowing this changes nothing except the quality of the knowing, makes it possible to stop searching for the exit that does not exist, stop believing in solutions that cannot work, stop hoping for permanent peace in a system designed for permanent striving, and to simply live, to simply continue. Not because it is good, but because it is what is happening, because the alternative is non-existence, and that carries its own kind of terror, its own questions about whether the absence of suffering justifies the absence of everything else, whether zero is better than negative, whether non-being is preferable to painful being. And most people, most of the time, choose painful being, choose to continue even when continuation is difficult, even when the architecture presses down, even when suffering is overwhelming. And this choice is not rational, is not based on calculation, is based on something deeper, something prior to reasons, something in the will itself that says yes to life even when life says no to the will, even when existence denies what existence most wants, which is rest, which is peace, which is the end of striving, but the striving cannot end while there is life. And so the circle closes, the architecture holds, the structure of suffering remains intact, and consciousness continues to move through it, continues to experience the gap between what is and what's wanted, continues to suffer, not because something is wrong, but because everything is exactly as it must be, exactly as the machinery dictates. And there is no escape except through the one door that ends all doors, the one exit that is final, and most hesitate at that threshold, turn back toward the architecture, toward the suffering they know, because the unknown might be worse or might be nothing, and nothing is difficult to choose when something, even painful something, is the only thing that has ever been experienced, is the only thing that consciousness knows how to be. Knowledge of death's timing changes everything, converts the abstract certainty into concrete countdown, transforms mortality from philosophical concept into calendar date, into the number of days remaining, into the tangible approaching of an endpoint that was always coming but was kept safely distant by uncertainty, by the not knowing that allowed life to proceed as if time were infinite, as if tomorrow were guaranteed, as if the future extended indefinitely, even though reason knows it does not, knows it cannot, knows that death is certain and that the certainty will arrive. But the arriving felt distant, felt abstract, felt like something that happens eventually, but not yet, not soon, not on a specific date that can be marked on calendars, that can be counted down to, that can be known in advance with accuracy that is not perfect but is close enough, is 96%, is the probability that the algorithm assigns after analysing the data, after processing the medical records, the genetic information, the lifestyle factors, the environmental exposures, the family history, the biomarkers, the patterns that correlate with longevity, with disease, with the failures that lead to death, and the failures are predictable, are following patterns that machine learning can detect, can model, can use to generate predictions that are accurate enough to be actionable, to be used by insurance companies, by employers, by governments, by anyone who has access to the data and the algorithms. And the access is spreading, is becoming easier, is approaching the point where anyone can know their death date, can receive the prediction, can see the number, can confront the countdown. And the confrontation is what changes everything, is what transforms life from open-ended to finite, from abstract mortality to concrete deadline, from the someday of death to the specific day, the specific year, the specific age at which the algorithm predicts the ending will come. And the coming is what becomes real, becomes present, becomes the fact that shapes every decision, every plan, every moment, because the moments are numbered, are limited, are approaching zero, and the zero is known, is visible, is the date that appears on the screen after the algorithm processes the data, after the calculation completes, after the probability is assigned, and the probability is high, is 96%, is accurate enough that insurance companies are using it, are adjusting premiums based on predicted death dates, are denying coverage to those whose dates are too near, are charging more to those whose dates reveal risk, reveal vulnerability, reveal the likelihood of claims, and the claims are what matter to insurers, are what drive the calculations, are what make death dates valuable information, are what justify the investment in algorithms, in data processing, in the machine learning systems that can predict mortality with accuracy that exceeds human intuition, that surpasses clinical judgment. That is better than what doctors can do, what actuaries can estimate, what anyone could know before the algorithms existed, and the existence is recent, is new, is the result of advances in computing, in data collection, in the availability of medical records, genetic sequences, lifestyle data, all the information that used to be scattered, that used to be private, that used to be inaccessible, but is now consolidated, is now analysed, is now feeding the algorithms that predict death dates. And the predictions are accurate, are reliable, are being used, are shaping decisions, are affecting lives, are creating the knowledge that was not available before, that humans did not have before, that changes what it means to be mortal, because mortality was always certain but was never scheduled, was never assigned a date, was never made concrete in the way that the algorithm makes it concrete, makes it specific, makes it countable. And the counting is what humans are doing, are responding to, are organising their lives around once they know, once they receive the prediction, once they see the date, and the seeing changes everything, makes priorities shift, makes some things urgent and other things irrelevant, makes the future feel different, feel shorter, feel like it is running out, and the running out is literal, is measurable, is the countdown that starts the moment the date is known, the moment the algorithm delivers its prediction. And the prediction is usually not exact, is usually a range, is usually giving a year rather than a day, but the year is specific enough, is concrete enough, is making death real in a way it was not real before. And the reality is what some cannot bear, is what drives some to ignore the prediction, to refuse the knowledge, to not ask for the date, to not run the algorithm, to maintain the uncertainty that allows life to feel open-ended, that allows the illusion of infinite time. And the illusion is functional, is protective, is what most humans need in order to function, in order to plan, in order to invest in futures that might not arrive. And the arrival is what the algorithm predicts, is what it calculates, is what it makes known. And the known is both liberation and burden, is both the gift of clarity and the curse of certainty, because certainty about death is not like certainty about other things, is not providing comfort, is not making life easier, is making life harder, is making every moment weighted, is making every choice consequential, is creating the pressure of the countdown, of the limited time, of the approaching zero. And the zero is death, is the end point, is the date that the algorithm predicts. And the prediction is accurate, is reliable, is being used, is shaping how people live. Once they know, once they receive the information, once they confront the countdown. And the confrontation is what matters, is what the algorithm creates, is the transformation of abstract mortality into concrete deadline. And the deadline is what changes behavior, is what makes some people quit their jobs, leave their marriages, pursue dreams they had deferred, make radical changes in the hope that the changes will alter the prediction, will push the date further away, will buy more time. And the time is what everyone wants, is what the algorithm quantifies, is what becomes precious once it is known to be limited. Once the limit is visible, once the countdown begins, and the beginning is the moment of knowing, is the moment the prediction is delivered, is the moment the algorithm completes its calculation and displays the date. And the date is sometimes soon, is sometimes far, is sometimes already past, and the past is the strangest case. Is the situation where the algorithm predicts a death date that has already occurred, that has already passed, and the passing means the prediction was wrong, means the person has outlived their calculated mortality, has survived beyond what the algorithm expected, and the expectation was based on data, was based on patterns, was based on probabilities that apply to populations, but not necessarily to individuals. And the individual is what matters, is what the algorithm is trying to predict. But individuals vary, individuals are unique, individuals do not always follow the patterns, and the patterns are statistical, are probabilistic, are accurate for groups, but not always for persons. And persons are what the algorithm is being applied to, is being used on, is generating predictions for, and the predictions are mostly accurate, are right 96% of the time. But the 4% is significant, is the margin where the algorithm fails, where the prediction is wrong, where people die earlier than predicted or survive longer than predicted. And the longer is what some experience, is what creates the strange situation of living past one's predicted death date, of waking up on the day after the day that was supposed to be the last day. And the last day was not the last, was not the ending, was just another day. And the day after is another day. And the days continue, and the continuation is confusing, is disorienting, is raising questions about what the prediction meant, about whether it was wrong, about whether the algorithm failed, or whether something changed, whether the person's condition improved, whether the factors that were feeding the prediction shifted, and the shifting is possible, is part of what makes the predictions not fixed, not absolute, not carved in stone, but calculated from data that is current at the moment of calculation, but that changes, that evolves, that reflects conditions that can improve or deteriorate. And the improvement is what some people achieve, is what some people work toward, is the reason some people change their lifestyles. After receiving the prediction, after seeing the date, after confronting the countdown. And the countdown motivates, creates urgency, creates the pressure to change, to improve, to extend the time, to push the date further away. And the pushing is sometimes successful, is sometimes resulting in new predictions, in updated calculations, in revised death dates that are later than the original dates. And the later is what everyone wants, is what the changes are aiming for, is what makes people exercise, eat differently, reduce stress, stop smoking, address conditions that were being ignored, take medications that were being skipped, make appointments that were being postponed, all in the hope that the algorithm will notice, will incorporate the changes, will recalculate, will generate a new prediction with a later date. And the later is what some people achieve, is what some people see when they run the algorithm again, when they check the prediction, when they look for evidence that their efforts have mattered, have changed the trajectory, have bought time. And the time is what matters, is what the algorithm quantifies, is what becomes visible through the prediction. And the prediction is not destiny, is not fate, is not fixed, is probability, is likelihood, is the best estimate based on data. But estimates can be wrong. Data can change, probabilities can shift. And the shifting is what makes the algorithm dynamic, makes the predictions update, makes the death dates change. Sometimes moving closer, sometimes moving further, sometimes disappearing entirely when new data arrives, when conditions improve, when the patterns that were predicting early death are disrupted by interventions, by treatments, by changes that alter the trajectory. And the trajectory is what the algorithm models, is what it calculates, is what it uses to predict the future. And the future is uncertain, is probabilistic, is not determined, but is shaped by choices, by circumstances, by the countless factors that influence health, that affect longevity, that determine when death arrives. And the arriving is what the algorithm predicts, is what it calculates with 96% accuracy. But the accuracy is for populations, is statistical, is not guaranteed for individuals. And individuals are what matter, are who receive the predictions, are who live with the knowledge, are who face the countdown. And the countdown is real, is concrete, is making mortality tangible in a way it never was before. And the before was uncertainty, was the not knowing that allowed life to feel open-ended, that allowed plans to extend indefinitely, that allowed the future to seem guaranteed even though it was not, even though death was always certain, always approaching, always inevitable. And the inevitable is what the algorithm makes visible, makes specific, makes countable. And the counting is what changes everything, is what transforms life. Once the date is known, once the prediction is received, once the algorithm delivers its calculation, and the calculation is accurate, is reliable, is being used, is shaping insurance, shaping employment, shaping medical care, shaping decisions about treatment, about intervention, about whether to invest in extending life, when the extension is predicted to be brief, when the algorithm says the time is short, when the date is near, and the near is what matters, is what determines coverage, determines access, determines whether resources are allocated, whether treatments are approved, whether hope is offered or withheld. And the withholding is what some fear, is what the algorithm enables, is the denial of care based on predicted death dates, based on the calculation that says the investment is not worth it, that the time remaining is too brief, that the return is insufficient, and the return is measured in life years, in quality-adjusted survival, in the metrics that reduce existence to numbers, to calculations, to the outputs of algorithms that predict mortality and that are used to decide who receives treatment and who does not, who gets coverage and who is denied, who is worth investing in and who is not. And the not worth is the judgment that the algorithm makes possible, is the decision that becomes justifiable when death dates are known, when predictions are reliable, when accuracy is 96% and the percent is high enough to be trusted, to be acted upon, to be used as basis for decisions that affect lives, that determine futures, that shape who survives and who does not. And the survival is what matters, is what everyone wants, is what the algorithm is supposedly helping by predicting, by warning, by providing information that can be used to intervene, to prevent, to extend life. But the extension is not guaranteed, is not automatic, is requiring resources, requiring access, requiring the willingness to invest in futures that might be brief, that might not extend far beyond the predicted date. And the date is what hangs over everything, is what shapes decisions, is what makes some futures seem worth pursuing and others not. And the not worth is the category that some people are placed into once their death dates are known, once their predictions reveal short timelines, limited futures, approaching endpoints. And the endpoints are what the algorithm calculates, are what it makes visible, are what transform mortality from abstract to concrete, from someday to specific day, from uncertain to known. And the known is what changes everything, is. What makes death real is what creates the countdown, the pressure, the urgency, the weight of limited time. And the time is running out, is approaching zero, is moving toward the date that the algorithm predicted, and the prediction is accurate, is reliable, is right 96% of the time. And the time is what matters, is what is being counted, is what is being lost, is what is approaching exhaustion. And the exhaustion is death, is the end point, is the zero that the countdown reaches, and the reaching is inevitable, is certain, is what the algorithm predicts, is what the calculation shows, is what the death date represents. And the representation is accurate, is reliable, is being used, is shaping reality, is making mortality concrete, is transforming death from philosophical abstraction into calendar appointment, into the date that is marked, that is known, that is approaching. And the approaching is what matters, is what changes everything, is what makes the algorithm powerful, is what makes the prediction consequential, is what transforms knowledge of death date from curiosity into burden, from information into weight, from prediction into reality. And the reality is that death is approaching, is scheduled, is calculated, is known. And the knowing changes everything, makes every moment count, makes every decision matter, makes life feel urgent, finite, precious, limited. And the limited is what the algorithm reveals, is what the death date represents, is what 96% accuracy means, which is that the countdown is real, is reliable, is approaching the end, and the end is death, is the date, is what the algorithm predicts, is what the calculation shows, is what some people know, is what some people live with, is what some people count down to. And the counting is real, is happening, is making mortality concrete, is transforming death from abstraction to appointment, from someday to specific day, from uncertain to known. And the known is the algorithm, is the prediction, is the death date that is calculated, that is displayed, that is accurate 96% of the time. And the time is running out, is approaching zero, is moving toward the date, and the date is death, is the end point, is what the algorithm predicts, is what some people know, is what changes everything, is the countdown, is the calculation, is the algorithm that predicts death date with 96% accuracy. And the accuracy is what matters, is what makes the prediction real, is what makes mortality concrete, is what makes death a date, a number, a countdown. And the countdown is happening, is real, is approaching zero, is moving toward death. And death is the algorithm, is the prediction, is the date that is known, that is calculated, that is approaching. And the approaching is certain, is reliable, is accurate 96% of the time. And the time is what remains, is what is counted, is what is running out. And the running out is death, is the date, is what the algorithm predicts. And the prediction is accurate, is real, is the countdown to death, to the end point, to the zero. And the zero is approaching, is certain, is the date that is known, that is calculated, that is predicted by the algorithm with 96% accuracy. And the accuracy is what makes it real, what makes it matter, what makes death a date. and the date is approaching is certain, is the countdown, is the algorithm, is the prediction, is death. Shame is not emotion but is technology, is the mechanism through which groups control individuals, through which societies enforce norms, through which collectives ensure conformity without the need for constant surveillance, constant punishment, constant external force, because the force becomes internal, becomes the voice inside that judges, that condemns, that produces the feeling of being fundamentally wrong, fundamentally defective, fundamentally unworthy. And this feeling is more powerful than any external punishment, is more effective than any threat, is the weapon that societies have perfected over millennia, the conversion of social judgment into self-judgment, the transformation of external control into internal monitoring. And the monitoring is constant, is automatic, is happening at every moment, in every decision, in every thought that might deviate from what is acceptable, what is expected, what is required. And the requirement is not explicit, is not written down, is absorbed through observation, through imitation, through the 1,000 small corrections that shape children into members of the group. And the shaping is violent, is coercive, is the moulding of consciousness to fit the pattern that the society demands. And the demands vary by culture, by context, by what behaviours serve the group's interests. But the mechanism is universal, is present in every society, is the way that humans have solved the problem of coordination, the problem of getting individuals to behave in ways that benefit the collective, even when those behaviours conflict with individual interest, and the conflict is constant. Is the tension between what the self wants and what the group requires? And shame is what tips the balance, is what makes the group's requirements feel like the self's requirements, is what converts external judgment into internal compulsion. And the compulsion is not experienced as coercion, but as conscience, as the sense of right and wrong that seems to come from within, but is really coming from the group, from the internalized voices of parents, of peers, of authorities, of all the representatives of social norms who have spoken, and whose speaking has been absorbed, has been converted into the inner voice that judges, that shames, that produces the feeling that is unbearable, that is worse than pain. That is the sense of being exposed, of being seen in one's wrongness, in one's defectiveness, in one's failure to meet the standards that everyone else seems to meet effortlessly. And the effortlessness is illusion, is the result of successful internalization, is what happens when shame has done its work, when the external has become internal, when the monitoring is so automatic that it feels like nature, like the way things are, like the voice of truth rather than the voice of power. And power is what shame is the exercise of control, is the way that the group extends its reach into the individual, into the mind, into the private space where decisions are made. And the decisions are not free, are not autonomous, are shaped by the anticipation of shame, by the fear of exposure, by the need to maintain the facade of being acceptable, of being worthy, of being someone who meets the standards. And the standards are impossible, are designed to be impossible, are set high enough that everyone fails, that everyone is vulnerable to shame, that everyone needs the group's forgiveness, the group's acceptance, the group's willingness to overlook the failures, as long as the proper contrition is shown, the proper submission is performed, the proper deference is given to the norms that were violated, and the violation is inevitable, is guaranteed, is the way that shame maintains its power. Because if everyone could meet the standards, then shame would lose its force, would become irrelevant, would no longer be useful for control. And so the standards are calibrated, are adjusted, are maintained at the level where most people are failing most of the time, are feeling inadequate, are needing reassurance, are seeking validation. And the seeking is the mechanism, is the way that shame produces conformity, produces obedience, produces the constant effort to be good, to be acceptable, to be worthy of belonging. And belonging is what is at stake, is what shame threatens, is the thing that will be lost if the shame is too great, if the exposure is too complete, if the judgment is too severe, and the severity is variable, is depending on culture, on context, on what the group needs to enforce, and what it needs to enforce varies, is different in honour cultures, where shame is about reputation, about the family's standing, about the public face that must be maintained, and in guilt cultures, where shame is about internal. States about intentions, about the purity of the conscience, and the conscience is the internalized judge, is the voice that speaks even when no one is watching, that produces guilt even in private, that makes the internal monitoring as effective as external surveillance, and the effectiveness is what makes guilt cultures powerful, is what allows them to function with less overt control, with less public punishment. Because the punishment is internal, is the guilt that gnaws, that torments, that produces the feeling of being wrong, even when the behaviour is hidden, even when the transgression is secret. And the secret is what guilt cultures target, is what they make unbearable, is what they convert into shame through the internalization of norms, through the creation of conscience, through the training of the inner voice to judge, to condemn, to produce the feeling that is worse than any external punishment. And the worse is the genius of the system, is the efficiency of shame, is the way that control becomes self-control, that power becomes invisible, that coercion becomes choice, and the choice is not free but is shaped by the anticipation of shame, by the fear of guilt, by the need to avoid the feeling that is unbearable, and the unbearable is what shame produces, is the emotion that is more painful than physical pain, that is more threatening than external danger, that is triggering the same neural circuits as social death, as exile, as the exclusion that in ancestral environments meant literal death, meant the end of survival. And so the fear of shame is ancient, is hardwired, is operating at levels deeper than reason, deeper than conscious thought, is producing reactions that are automatic, that are visceral, that are overwhelming. And the overwhelming is what makes shame effective, is what makes it useful for control, is what makes it the primary mechanism through which societies enforce norms, maintain order, ensure that individuals behave in ways that serve the collective. And the serving is not voluntary, is not chosen, is coerced through shame, through the threat of exposure, through the fear of judgment. And the judgment is constant, is omnipresent, is coming from others and from the self, from the internalized voices that have become the conscience, the superego, the inner critic that never rests, never forgives, never allows the self to feel acceptable, to feel worthy, to feel free from the threat of shame. And the threat is maintained through public shaming, through the rituals that expose transgressions, that make violations visible, that demonstrate what happens to those who break the rules. And the demonstration is warning, is deterrent, is the reminder that shame is always possible, is always lurking, is always ready to destroy the reputation, the standing, the sense of belonging that makes life bearable. And the bearable is what shame threatens, is what it takes away, is what it uses as leverage to control, to coerce, to enforce the norms that maintain the group, that preserve the hierarchy, that ensure that power is distributed according to the rules, and the rules are not natural, are not discovered, are imposed, are created by those who benefit from them, by those who have power, by those who use shame to maintain their position, to prevent challenge, to ensure that those below stay below, that those who are shamed remain shamed, that the hierarchy is preserved, and the preservation is what shame serves, is what it accomplishes, is the maintenance of order through the creation of internal monitoring, through the transformation of social control into self-control. And the self-control is not freedom, but is the most perfect form of slavery, is the condition where the chains are invisible, where the prison is internal, where the guard is the self, and the self cannot escape, cannot rebel, cannot refuse, because the refusal would produce shame, would trigger the feeling that is unbearable, would expose the self to judgment. And the judgment is what is feared most, is what drives behaviour, is what makes people do things they do not want to do, believe things they do not believe, perform roles they do not choose, because the alternative is shame, is exposure, is the loss of belonging, and belonging is survival, is the thing that makes life possible, that makes existence tolerable, that provides meaning and purpose and the sense that one matters. And mattering is what shame threatens, is what it takes away, is what it holds hostage. And the hostage is the self, is the identity that is constructed through the internalization of norms, through the absorption of judgments, through the acceptance of the standards that the group imposes, and the imposing is not negotiable, is not optional, is the price of membership, the cost of belonging, the requirement for survival, and survival requires shame, requires the capacity to feel it, to be shaped by it, to use it to regulate behaviour, to monitor thought, to police the boundaries of the acceptable. And the acceptable is narrow, is constrained, is defined by the group, and the group's definition is arbitrary, is variable, is serving interests that are not the individual's interests, that are the interests of power, of hierarchy, of the maintenance of the order that benefits some at the expense of others. And the others are kept in place through shame, through the feeling that they are less, that they are wrong, that they are unworthy, and the unworthiness is not fact but is assignment, is the judgment that the group makes, that the individual internalizes, that becomes the truth of the self, the core belief around which identity is organized, and the organization is pathological, is producing suffering, is creating the sense that the self is fundamentally defective, fundamentally wrong, fundamentally deserving of the judgment, and the judgment is harsh, is relentless, is coming from within and without, from the self and from others, and the others are always watching, always judging, always ready to shame. And the readiness is maintained through public shaming, through the revival of practices that were thought to be barbaric, to be outdated, to be incompatible with modern values, but are returning, are being embraced, are being used with new technologies, with social media, with the platforms that make public shaming instantaneous, global, permanent. And the permanence is new, is the addition that technology brings, is the way that shame now lasts forever, is recorded, is searchable, is never forgotten. And the never forgotten is the enhancement of shame, is the intensification of its power, is the conversion of temporary judgment into permanent stigma. And the stigma is the mark, is the label, is the thing that defines the person, that reduces them to their failure, to their transgression, to the moment when they were exposed, when they were judged, when they were shamed. And the shaming is not correction, is not education, is not intended to help, but is intended to punish, to exclude, to destroy. And the destruction is what public shaming achieves, is what it is designed to do, is the elimination of the person from the community, from the acceptable, from the realm of those who matter. And the mattering is what is taken away, is what shame removes, is what is lost when the judgment is public, when the exposure is complete, when the person becomes the embodiment of wrongness, of defectiveness, of unworthiness, and the unworthiness is total, is overwhelming, is the condition that produces not just embarrassment, but the deeper shame, the toxic shame, the shame that is not about what one did, but about what one is, and the is the problem, is the conversion of behaviour into identity, is the judgment that extends from the action to the actor, from the mistake to the person, from the moment to the essence. And the essence is what shame targets, is what it damages, is what it destroys, is the sense of being fundamentally acceptable, fundamentally worthy, fundamentally deserving of existence. And the existence becomes questionable, becomes something that must be justified, must be earned, must be proven through the constant performance of acceptability, and the performance is exhausting, is impossible, is the burden that shame creates, is the weight that is carried by everyone who has internalized the judgment, who has absorbed the norms, who has become the monitor of their own behavior. And the monitoring is constant, is automatic, is producing anxiety, is producing the sense that at any moment the failure might happen, the exposure might occur, the shame might descend, and the descending is what is feared, is what drives the performance, is what makes people desperate to be good, to be acceptable, to be beyond reproach. And the beyond reproach is impossible, is unattainable, is the standard that ensures everyone is vulnerable, everyone is exposed, everyone is subject to shame, and the subject is the self, is the identity that is constructed through shame, that is defined by the internalized judgments, that is shaped by the fear of exposure. And the exposure is what social media enables, is what the digital age amplifies, is the possibility that at any moment anything might be revealed, anything might be judged, anything might become the basis for public shaming. And the basis is often trivial, is often a mistake, is often something that in another context would be ignored, would be forgotten, would be forgiven, but in the context of public shaming becomes unforgivable, becomes the thing that defines, that destroys, that reduces the person to the object of judgment, to the target of collective rage, to the scapegoat that the group needs, that the society uses, that shame requires. Because shame is not just individual, but is collective, is not just personal, but is social, is not just feeling, but is function, is the mechanism through which groups maintain cohesion, through which societies enforce norms, through which power maintains itself, and the maintenance is achieved through the constant threat of shame, through the ever-present possibility of exposure, through the fear that keeps people in line, keeps them conforming, keeps them performing the roles that the society assigns. And the assignment is not chosen, is not negotiated, is imposed through shame, through the feeling that to deviate is to be wrong, to be defective, to be unworthy. And the unworthiness is the lever, is the tool, is the way that power operates, is the currency that shame represents, is the thing that is spent, that is accumulated, that is traded in the social economy, where reputation is wealth, where honour is capital, where shame is debt, and the debt is inherited, is passed down, is the legacy of transgression, is what families carry, what lineages bear, what communities cannot escape. Because shame is not just about the individual, but is about the group, is about the collective honour that must be maintained, that must be protected, that must be defended against the contamination of shame. And the contamination is what happens when one member transgresses, when one person is exposed, when one individual brings shame upon the family, upon the community, upon the collective. And the collective responds with punishment, with exclusion, with the violence that is justified by the need to restore honour, to remove the stain, to eliminate the source of shame. And the elimination can be social, can be physical, can be the death that honour cultures prescribe, that honour killings enforce, that the logic of shame demands when the transgression is too great, when the exposure is too complete, when the only way to restore honour is to destroy the source of dishonour, and the destruction is murder, is violence, is the extreme form of shame's power, is what happens when shame is not just emotion, but is law, is not just feeling, but is justice, is not just internal, but is external, is enforced not just by conscience, but by the community. And the community is the enforcer, is the judge, is the executioner, is the thing that makes shame lethal, that makes shame literal death. And the death is what shame has always threatened, is what it has always implied, is what it is metaphorically, and sometimes literally, producing, is the end of social existence, the end of belonging, the end of the self as recognised, as valued, as mattering. And the mattering is what makes life worth living, is what makes existence bearable, is what shame takes away, is what shame holds hostage, is what shame uses to control, to coerce, to enforce the norms that maintain the group, that preserve the hierarchy, that ensure that power remains distributed according to the rules, and the rules are maintained through shame, are enforced through guilt, are perpetuated through the internalization of judgment, through the conversion of external control into internal monitoring, through the creation of the conscience that is not freedom, but is the most sophisticated form of slavery, is the condition where the individual has become the agent of their own oppression, has become the enforcer of the norms that harm them, has become the voice that judges, that shames, that makes life unbearable. And the unbearable is what shame produces, is what it is designed to produce, is the mechanism through which societies control individuals, through which power maintains itself, through which the currency of shame is spent, is accumulated, is traded, is the thing that makes social life possible, that makes coordination achievable, that makes conformity enforceable, and the enforcement is continuous, is total, is the permanent condition of social existence, is the cost of belonging, is the price of survival, is the burden that everyone carries, is the weight of shame, of guilt, of the internalized judgment that never rests, never forgives, never allows the self to be free, to be acceptable, to be beyond the reach of shame. And the reach is infinite, is extending into every moment, every decision, every thought, is the omnipresent threat that keeps people in line, that makes them perform, that makes them conform, that makes them serve the group even when the group is serving power, is maintaining hierarchy, is preserving the order that benefits the few at the expense of the many, and the many are controlled through shame, are kept in place through guilt, are made to believe that their suffering is their fault, is their failure, is their unworthiness, and the unworthiness is the lie, is the mechanism, is the currency of shame, is what keeps the system running, what makes power invisible, what converts coercion into choice, and the choice is not free but is shaped by shame, by guilt, by the fear of judgment, by the anticipation of exposure, by the threat that is always there, always present, always ready to descend. And the descending is what everyone fears, is what everyone avoids, is what everyone works to prevent. And the preventing is the work, is the performance, is the conformity, is the submission, is the acceptance of the norms, the internalization of the judgment, the absorption of the shame that is the currency, that is the mechanism, that is the way that societies control, that power maintains itself, that individuals are shaped into members of the group. And the shaping is violence, is coercion, is the transformation of the self into the thing that the group needs. And the need is conformity, is obedience, is the willingness to carry the shame, to feel the guilt, to be the subject of judgment. And the subject is what shame creates, is what guilt produces, is the self that is never free, never acceptable, never beyond the reach of the currency that is shame, that is guilt, that is the mechanism through which humanity controls itself, enforces its norms, maintains its order, and the order is maintained through suffering, through the feeling that is unbearable, through the emotion that is technology, through the currency of shame. Meaning was not invented but was given, was not constructed but was inherited, was not the product of individual reflection but was the air that was breathed, the framework that was absorbed, the structure that made sense of suffering, of labour, of death, of everything that otherwise would be unbearable. And this given meaning came from stories, from gods, from hierarchies that extended beyond the human into the cosmic, into realms where purposes were assigned, where roles were fixed, where every life, no matter how small, had significance, because it was part of a larger pattern, a divine plan, a cosmic order that justified suffering, that explained inequality, that made death not an end, but a transition. And the transition was to something, was leading somewhere, was part of a narrative that continued beyond the visible, beyond the mortal, beyond the contingent facts of this world, into eternal truths that grounded everything. And the grounding is what modernity has lost, is what the Enlightenment destroyed, is what science dissolved by showing that the cosmic order was projection, was fiction, was the human need for meaning imposed onto a universe that has no meaning, that cares nothing for human purposes, that operates according to laws that are indifferent to whether anyone suffers or flourishes. And the indifference is what modern consciousness must confront, must live with, must somehow survive, and the survival is difficult, is producing the crisis that thinkers have been naming for centuries. The meaning crisis, the disenchantment, the death of God that Nietzsche announced not as celebration, but as diagnosis, as the recognition that the framework had collapsed, that the stories no longer worked, that the gods were no longer believable. And the unbelievability was not failure of faith, but was the inevitable result of knowledge, of the scientific worldview that explained through mechanism what had been explained through purpose, that showed causes where there had been reasons, that revealed the universe to be vast and old and empty of anything like human meaning. And the emptiness is what modern consciousness inherits, is the vacuum that religion once filled, is the absence that creates the crisis, because humans need meaning, are built to seek it, are suffering without it, are experiencing the pointlessness as pathology, as depression, as the epidemic of despair that characterizes wealthy secular societies, where material needs are met but existential needs are not, where comfort is abundant but purpose is absent, where life is long but feels empty, and the emptiness is not new, but the awareness of it is new, is the result of losing the stories that made the emptiness tolerable, that covered it over, that provided the illusion of significance. An illusion is what the religious frameworks were. But they were functional illusions, were useful fictions, were false but necessary. And the necessity is what modernity has trouble acknowledging, has trouble accepting, because modernity is committed to truth, to science, to the rejection of comfortable lies, but the rejection has costs, is leaving people without the resources to make sense of existence, without the narratives that make suffering meaningful, without the structures that provide purpose. And purpose cannot be manufactured, cannot be created through individual will, cannot be generated by deciding to care about something, because caring requires reasons, and reasons require frameworks, and frameworks are inherited, not invented, are received, not constructed, are given by cultures, by traditions, by the accumulated wisdom of generations who faced the same emptiness and created stories to fill it. And the stories worked not because they were true, but because they were shared, were collective, were providing roles and meanings that were recognized by others, that were part of a social world where purpose was public, was confirmed, was real in the way that social facts are real. And social facts require agreement, require participation, require that people act as if the meaning is there, and the as if is what modernity has trouble with, is what secular consciousness resists, because acting as if seems like pretending, seems like bad faith, seems like the self-deception that Sartre warned against. And so modern individuals are caught between the need for meaning and the inability to believe in the sources of meaning, between the hunger for purpose and the knowledge that purpose is not inherent but is imposed, is constructed, is chosen. And chosen meaning feels arbitrary, feels thin, feels like it could be otherwise, and therefore feels like it is not really meaning at all, but is just preference, just a subjective valuing that has no grounding, no justification, no claim to be anything more than personal taste. And taste is not enough, is not providing the weight that meaning requires, is not making life feel significant, is not answering the question of why any of this matters. And the why is the question that modernity cannot answer, is the question that haunts secular consciousness, is the question that produces the crisis. And the crisis is not just intellectual, but is visceral, is felt, is experienced as the flatness of existence, as the sense that nothing really matters, that everything is permitted because nothing is forbidden, that values are just opinions, and opinions are just brain states, and brain states are just physics. And the physics is indifferent, is not caring, is not providing any reason to do anything, to be anything, to continue existing. And the continuing is what becomes questionable, is what the meaning crisis threatens, is why suicide rates rise, why despair spreads, why affluent societies are seeing increases in deaths of despair, in overdoses, in suicides, in all the ways that people exit when existence feels unbearable. And the unbearable is not material, but is existential, is not about lacking things, but about lacking reasons, lacking purposes, lacking the framework that makes effort meaningful, that makes suffering tolerable, that makes life worth living. And the worth is what is missing, is what cannot be found, is what modernity has destroyed without replacing. And the replacements that have been tried are failing, are not working, are revealing themselves to be inadequate substitutes for what was lost. And what was lost was not just belief in God, but was the entire worldview that made God plausible, that made divine purpose conceivable, that made cosmic meaning possible. And the possible is what has been eliminated, is what science has shown to be projection, to be anthropomorphism, to be the mistaken attribution of human qualities to the universe. And the mistake is understandable, is natural, is the way that consciousness makes sense of the world. But it is still mistake, is still error, is still something that cannot be sustained once knowledge advances, once the mechanisms are understood, once the causes are revealed and the revealing is irreversible, is not allowing return to innocence, is not permitting the restoration of belief, is creating the permanent condition of disenchantment, of knowing that the meanings are not discovered but are created, are not inherent but are imposed, and the imposed cannot carry the weight that the discovered could carry, cannot provide the grounding that the inherent provided, cannot make life feel significant in the way that cosmic purpose made it feel significant. And so modernity is searching, is trying to find secular substitutes, is trying to create meanings that do not depend on the supernatural, on the transcendent, on the stories that are no longer believable. And the substitutes that are tried are varied, are including humanism, the belief that human values are sufficient, that human flourishing is purpose enough, that making life better for people is meaning enough. But humanism is thin, is not providing the depth that religious meaning provided, is not explaining why human flourishing matters, is not grounding value in anything beyond human preference. And preference is not enough, is not answering the question of why this preference rather than another. Why care about flourishing rather than about something else? And the something else is always available, is always an option, and without grounding, the choice feels arbitrary, feels like it could be different, and what can be different feels less real, less binding, less meaningful. And so humanism satisfies some, but not others, works for those who do not need deep grounding, but does not work for those who do, who need reasons that extend beyond the human, beyond the contingent, beyond the arbitrary. And these people are searching, are trying other substitutes, are trying nationalism, the belief that the nation provides purpose, that serving the collective gives life meaning, that sacrifice for the group is the answer. But nationalism is dangerous, is leading to conflict, is producing the us versus them that justifies violence, that makes the other into enemy, that converts the search for meaning into the justification for harm. And the harm is what makes nationalism unsustainable, as meaning is what reveals it to be destructive, to be the kind of substitute that is worse than the absence it is trying to fill. And so nationalism is rejected by many, is seen as the wrong answer, but the rejection leaves the question open, leaves the search continuing. And another substitute that is tried is ideology, the belief that political movements provide purpose, that working for justice or equality or liberation gives life meaning. That commitment to the cause is the answer, and for some this works, is providing the structure that was lost, is giving roles and purposes, and the sense of being part of something larger, something important, something that justifies effort and sacrifice. But ideology is also dangerous, is also producing conflict, is also dividing the world into believers and heretics, is creating the certainty that is intolerant, that is unwilling to coexist with doubt. And the doubt is what ideology cannot tolerate, is what it must suppress. And the suppression is violence, is coercion, is the same problem that religion had, that any totalizing meaning system has, which is that it cannot allow alternatives, cannot permit questioning, cannot coexist with the plurality that modernity also values, and so ideology is failing as substitute, is producing as much harm as good, is not solving the meaning crisis, but is creating new problems, new conflicts, new reasons for despair, and the despair is what remains, is what continues, is what characterizes modern consciousness, when all the substitutes are tried and found wanting, when the search for meaning exhausts itself, when the recognition arrives that maybe meaning cannot be found, cannot be manufactured, cannot be created through individual or collective will, because meaning was never something that humans made, but was something they received, was given by frameworks that emerged over centuries, that were refined through generations, that worked because they were inherited, not because they were chosen, and choosing meaning is the modern problem, is the thing that modernity demands, but that consciousness cannot do, because choice requires reasons, and reasons require grounding, and grounding is what is missing, is what was lost with the death of God, with the collapse of cosmic purpose, with the recognition that the universe is indifferent, and the indifference is the truth, is what science reveals, is what honesty requires accepting, and the acceptance is what some philosophers advocate, is what Camus called absurdism, is the response that acknowledges the meaninglessness while refusing to be destroyed by it, that confronts the absurd without fleeing into suicide or into false hope, that lives with full awareness of the void while continuing to live, while continuing to act, while continuing to find moments of joy and connection and beauty, even though none of it means anything in the cosmic sense. None of it matters beyond the moment. None of it will be remembered once consciousness ends, and the ending is inevitable, is coming for everyone, is the final proof that nothing matters, that all effort is futile, that existence is temporary and meaning is impossible. And yet the absurd response is to continue anyway, is to rebel against the meaninglessness, not by denying it, but by living in spite of it, by affirming life without justification, by finding satisfaction in the act of living itself, rather than in any purpose that living serves. And the serving is what is abandoned, is what the absurd lets go of, is what is recognized as impossible. And the impossible is what modernity must accept, must live with, must somehow survive. And the survival is not guaranteed, is not easy, is requiring a transformation of consciousness, a new way of being human that does not need cosmic meaning, that does not require divine purpose, that can tolerate the void without filling it, that can live with the knowledge that existence is contingent, that meaning is constructed, that everything could be otherwise. And the otherwise is what makes nothing necessary, nothing absolute, nothing secure, and the insecurity is the permanent condition, is what modernity offers, is what the horizon of meaning looks like when the horizon keeps receding, when the destination is revealed to be illusion, when the search is recognized as endless because there is nothing to find, no meaning to discover, no purpose to uncover, only the void, only the emptiness, only the silence of the universe that does not answer, that does not care, that does not provide what humans need. And the need is real, is not going away, is producing the crisis that may not have solution, that may be the permanent condition of secular consciousness, of enlightened awareness, of the knowledge that liberates from illusion, but enslaves to despair. And the despair is what remains, is what continues, is what characterizes the horizon of meaning in modernity. the flat landscape where purposes used to stand, where gods used to reign, where cosmic order used to justify suffering, and now there is nothing, or there is only what can be constructed, what can be chosen, what can be performed, and the performance feels hollow, feels fake, feels like going through motions, without conviction, and conviction is what is missing, is what cannot be manufactured, is what made religious meaning work, and without it the secular substitutes fail. The humanisms and nationalisms and ideologies all fail because they lack the weight, lack the depth, lack the grounding that conviction requires, and the requires is what consciousness needs, is what makes meaning meaning rather than just preference. And preference is not enough, has never been enough, will never be enough, because humans are built for meaning, are requiring it, are suffering without it. And the suffering is the crisis, is the modern condition, is the permanent state of existence at the horizon of meaning, where the horizon is empty, is revealing nothing, is offering nothing except the recognition that meaning was always illusion, was always projection, was always the human need imposed onto a universe that provides nothing, that offers nothing, that is indifferent to whether anyone finds meaning or drowns in meaninglessness. And the drowning is happening, is visible, is the epidemic of despair, is the meaning crisis that modernity cannot solve, because the solution would require believing what cannot be believed, accepting what knowledge has revealed to be false, returning to illusions that have been seen through. And the seeing through is irreversible, is permanent, is leaving consciousness stranded at the horizon of meaning, where the horizon extends forever and reveals nothing, where the search continues because it must, but where nothing is found because nothing is there, because meaning is not discovered but was always created, was always the story that consciousness told itself, and the story has ended, has been revealed as story, and what remains is the silence, the emptiness, the void that religions were covering, that purposes were filling, that cosmic orders were organizing, and the organizing is gone, is lost, is leaving consciousness alone with existence, with the fact of being without the reason for being, with life without purpose, with experience without significance, and the without is the horizon, is what modernity sees when it looks for meaning, and the looking continues, must continue, because consciousness cannot stop seeking what it needs. But the seeking finds nothing, reveals nothing, discovers nothing except the fact that there is nothing to discover, that the horizon is empty, that meaning is absent, that purpose is impossible, and the impossible is what must be lived with, must be endured, must be survived, and the survival is what absurdism attempts, what Camus offered, what some find sufficient, but many do not, many cannot, many are destroyed by the emptiness, by the meaninglessness, by the recognition that nothing matters and nothing can be done to make it matter. And the cannot is the tragedy, is the modern condition, is the permanent crisis at the horizon of meaning, where meaning has ended, where purpose has collapsed, where existence continues but significance does not, and the does not is what remains, is what persists, is what characterizes life at the horizon, where the horizon is empty, where the search reveals nothing, where consciousness is alone with its need for meaning in a universe that provides none, that offers none, that will never provide any, because meaning is not there, was never there, is only here in consciousness, in the stories that are told, in the illusions that are maintained, and the maintaining is what modernity cannot do, is what knowledge prevents, is what honesty forbids, and so the crisis continues, the despair persists, the horizon remains empty, and consciousness must somehow survive, must somehow continue, must somehow live without meaning, without purpose, without the grounding that makes existence bearable, and the bearable becomes questionable, becomes doubtful, becomes the thing that many cannot achieve, and the achieving is the challenge, is the task, is what modernity demands without providing resources, without offering solutions, without giving answers, because there are no answers, there is no solution, There is only the void, only the emptiness, only the silence. And the silence is what speaks, is what reveals, is what remains at the horizon of meaning where meaning has ended, and nothing has replaced it, and nothing ever will. Pain does not end with the person who experiences it, does not die with the body that carried it, but persists, transmits, moves through generations like a current that flows beneath consciousness, shaping those who come after in ways they do not understand, in ways they cannot name. And this transmission is not metaphorical, is not merely the passing of stories or the modelling of behaviour, though it includes those things, but is written into biology, into the methylation patterns on genes, into the expression profiles that determine which parts of the genetic code are active and which are silenced. And the silencing is not random, is not arbitrary, but is responsive to experience, to environment, to the stresses that the organism faces. And when the stress is severe, when the trauma is overwhelming, when the suffering exceeds what can be processed and integrated, the organism adapts, changes its expression patterns, alters the way genes function, and these alterations persist, are maintained across cell divisions, across the lifespan, and in some cases, across generations, are passed to children who never experienced the original trauma but carry its signature in their cells, in their stress response systems, in the heightened reactivity that makes them vulnerable to threats that their parents faced but they have not. And the vulnerability is not chosen, is not learned, is inherited, is biological, is the body remembering what the mind never knew. And the remembering is not conscious, is not available to introspection, is only visible in symptoms, in patterns of response, in the ways that descendants of trauma survivors react to the world, and the reactions are often excessive, are disproportionate to present circumstances, are responding not to what is happening now, but to what happened then, to the grandmother who starved, to the grandfather who was tortured, to the ancestors who were enslaved or displaced or murdered. And the murdered are not gone, are not finished, are still speaking through the bodies of the living, through the nervous systems that were shaped by their suffering, through the epigenetic marks that carry forward the biological memory of what was done. And what was done cannot be undone, cannot be erased, cannot be forgotten, because it is not stored in memory, but in structure, in the physical organization of the organism, in the ways that cells respond to signals, in the thresholds for activation, in the baseline levels of stress hormones. And these levels are set during development, are calibrated by the environment the developing organism encounters. And if the mother is traumatized, if she is living in fear, if her stress systems are chronically activated, the fetus is bathed in cortisol, in the chemical signatures of danger. And the developing brain adapts, prepares, assumes the world will be hostile. And this assumption is not a thought but a configuration, is the wiring of neural circuits, the tuning of receptor densities, the establishment of set points that will persist long after birth, long after the original danger has passed. And the passing is not complete, is not final, because the danger is not just external, but is now internal, is part of the organism's structure, is the way it has been built. And the building is what trauma does, is the remodeling of the organism to survive threats that may or may not continue to exist. And when the threats do not continue, when the environment becomes safe, the organism does not automatically adjust, does not recalibrate, because the recalibration is difficult, is requiring new experiences, new safety, sustained over time. And even then the original programming is not erased, but is overlaid, is suppressed, but remains available, remains capable of being reactivated if circumstances change, if danger returns, and the return is expected, is anticipated by systems that were shaped by trauma, that are always waiting for the threat to appear, and the waiting is exhausting, is the chronic activation that wears down the body, that accelerates aging, that produces illness that shortens life. And the shortening is transmitted, is part of the inheritance, is what descendants receive, along with the shape of the face and the colour of the eyes. They receive the legacy of suffering, the biological record of what their ancestors endured, and the enduring is not over, is continuing in the present. In the bodies that carry forward the marks, in the lives that are shaped by reactivity they did not choose, by fear they did not earn, by suffering that is not theirs but is in them, is part of them, is what they are, and what they are is not just themselves, but the accumulation of generations, the layering of experience, the sedimentation of pain, and the pain is collective, is not belonging to individuals but to lineages, to communities, to peoples who have been subjected to violence, to oppression, to the systematic destruction of culture and identity, and the destruction is not complete, is never complete because the people persist, the lineages continue, the communities survive, but the survival is not unchanged, is not untouched, is carrying the wounds, the scars, the alterations that trauma produced, and the production is ongoing, is not a single event, but a process, a transgenerational process where the effects of trauma in one generation become the conditions for trauma in the next, become the vulnerabilities, the sensitivities, the propensities that make descendants more likely to suffer, more likely to develop disorders, more likely to struggle with the same demons that haunted their parents. And the haunting is not superstition, is not folklore, is biology, is the way that history writes itself onto bodies, into genomes, into the regulatory systems that determine which genes are expressed and which are silenced. And the silencing is sometimes protective, is sometimes adaptive, is turning off genes that would be harmful in a dangerous environment. But the protection becomes problem when the environment changes, when safety returns, when the genes that were silenced are needed again, and the need is not met, the genes remain silent, and the organism functions at reduced capacity, functions as if still in danger, still in deprivation, still in the conditions that shaped its ancestors. And the shaping is transmission, is the way that trauma moves across time, inhabits new bodies, new lives, without ever announcing itself, without ever being recognized for what it is. And what it is inheritance, is the legacy that no one chose, that no one wanted, that is carried nonetheless, is carried in silence, in shame, in the unspoken sense that something is wrong, that something is broken, that the self is damaged in ways that cannot be explained, that make no sense given the safety of the present, given the absence of direct trauma, but the absence is not complete, is not real, because the trauma is present, is here, is in the body, in the nervous system, in the patterns of reactivity that were established before birth, before consciousness, before the possibility of choice. And choice is not available, is not part of this inheritance, because the inheritance is automatic, is biological, is not something that can be refused or returned, is only something that can be carried, can be lived with, can be passed forward, unless the cycle is broken. And breaking the cycle is difficult, is requiring awareness, is requiring intervention, is requiring that the trauma be recognized, be named, be brought into consciousness, where it can be processed, where it can be integrated, where its grip can be loosened. But the loosening is not guaranteed, is not automatic, is requiring work, is requiring therapy, is requiring the creation of new experiences, new safety, new patterns that can override the old. And the override is partial, is incomplete, is never total, because the old patterns are deep, are foundational, are part of the structure, and structure is resistant to change, is maintaining itself, is reproducing itself, is the reason why trauma persists, why it transmits, why descendants find themselves struggling with issues that seem to come from nowhere, that have no clear source in their own experience, but are rooted in the experience of those who came before. And those who came before are not past, are not gone, are present in the bodies of the living, are speaking through symptoms, through patterns, through the reactivity that makes no sense until the history is known, until the lineage is traced, until the connection is made between present suffering and past trauma. And the connection is not always visible. is not always traceable because the transmission is not direct, is not conscious, is happening at levels below awareness, in the biology, in the epigenetics, in the ways that genes are regulated, and regulation is the mechanism, is how the environment gets under the skin, how experience becomes biology, how trauma writes itself into the code, not by changing the sequence but by changing the expression, by adding methyl groups to the DNA, by modifying histones, by altering the accessibility of genes to the transcription machinery. And these alterations are reversible in principle, are not mutations, are not permanent changes to the sequence, but in practice they are stable, are persisting, are passed to daughter cells when cells divide, are sometimes passed to offspring when gametes form, and the passing is the inheritance, is the way that trauma becomes. Transgenerational becomes a legacy that spans lifetimes, that spans centuries, that connects descendants to ancestors they never met, whose names they do not know, whose suffering they do not remember, but nonetheless carry in their bodies, in their stress responses, in their vulnerabilities, and the vulnerabilities are real, are biological, are making descendants more sensitive to stress, more reactive to threat, more likely to develop PTSD, more likely to suffer from anxiety, from depression, from the disorders that cluster in families, not just because of genes, but because of the regulatory changes that genes undergo in response to trauma. And the response is adaptive in the moment, is helping the organism survive, but becomes maladaptive when transmitted. When the environment no longer matches the adaptations, when the descendants are living in safety, but their bodies are prepared for war, and the war is historical, is not present, but the preparation persists, is the mismatch that creates suffering, that makes normal life difficult, that makes challenges overwhelming, that produces symptoms that seem excessive, that are judged by others as weakness, as overreaction, as personal failing, when really they are the inheritance, are the biological legacy of trauma that was not chosen, was not earned, was simply received, was transmitted through mechanisms that the descendants did not control and usually do not understand. And the understanding is what begins healing, is what makes intervention possible, is what allows the cycle to be recognized as cycle, as pattern, as something that is not inevitable, is not destiny, is not the way things have to be, but is the way things have been, is the history, is the accumulation of pain across generations, and the accumulation can be interrupted, can be metabolized, can be processed in ways that prevent further transmission. And the prevention is not easy, is not simple, is requiring that the inherited trauma be made conscious, be brought into awareness, be given language, be placed in context, be understood, not as personal failing, but as historical wound, as the legacy of violence, of oppression, of collective trauma that was inflicted on communities, on peoples, on entire lineages. And the lineages carry forward the marks, carry forward the biological memory, carry forward the heightened reactivity, the altered stress responses, the vulnerabilities that are not weaknesses but are adaptations, are the ways that organisms prepared themselves and their descendants for survival in hostile conditions. And the conditions have changed, but the preparations remain in the epigenetics, in the gene expression patterns, in the methylation marks that persist across cell divisions, across lifetimes, across generations. And the generations are connected not just by culture, not just by story, not just by memory, but by biology, by the physical inheritance of trauma's effects. And the effects are measurable, are detectable, are visible in studies of Holocaust survivors and their children, in studies of famine survivors and their grandchildren, in studies of enslaved peoples and their descendants. And the descendants show the marks, show the alterations, show the biological signatures of trauma they never directly experienced. And the indirect experience is the mechanism, is the transmission through mother's stress during pregnancy, through father's sperm at conception, through the intrauterine environment, through the early years when the nervous system is being wired, when the stress response systems are being calibrated, when the organism is learning what kind of world it has been born into, and the learning is not cognitive, is not conscious, is happening at the level of physiology, is setting the baseline, is establishing the patterns that will persist. And the persistence is the problem, is the reason why trauma is transgenerational, is why the effects extend beyond the traumatized generation to those who come after, who inherit not just the memory, but the biology, not just the story, but the structure, not just the narrative, but the nervous system that was shaped by suffering. And the shaping is inheritance, is what cannot be escaped, is what is carried forward until it is metabolized, until it is processed, until the cycle is broken by someone who recognizes what is happening, who understands the transmission, who does the work of healing, not just for themselves, but for the lineage, for the ancestors, whose suffering is still present, still active, still shaping lives, and for the descendants who will either inherit the trauma or inherit the healing, will either receive the unprocessed pain or will receive the integration, the metabolization, the transformation of trauma into wisdom, into resilience, into the capacity to bear what was unbearable. And the bearing is what breaks the cycle, is what prevents transmission, is what allows the next generation to be free of the burden, to live without the reactivity, without the hypervigilance, without the sense that danger is everywhere, that safety is illusion, that the world is hostile and the hostility is historical, is real in the sense that it happened, that it shaped bodies, that it left marks, but is not present, is not current, is not the reality that descendants face, except that it is present in them, is current in their physiology, is the reality they inhabit, because their bodies are still responding to threats that are generations old. And the old is not past, is not finished, is ongoing in the biological present, in the stress response that activates too easily, in the immune system that is dysregulated, in the inflammatory markers that are elevated, in all the ways that trauma persists in the body long after the traumatic event has ended. And when the body that persists is not the body that was traumatized, but is the body of a descendant, then the transmission is visible, is undeniable, is proof that trauma is not contained within individuals, but spreads across time, across generations, becomes the inheritance that shapes families, communities, peoples, and the shaping is not deterministic, is not fate, is not making the future inevitable, but is making certain futures more likely, is creating vulnerabilities, is establishing patterns that will repeat unless interrupted, unless metabolized, unless transformed through the difficult work of bringing the unconscious into consciousness, the biological into awareness, the inherited into the examined. And the examination is what makes change possible, is what allows descendants to recognize that what they feel is not just theirs, is not just personal, is not just individual pathology, but is the echo of historical trauma, is the reverberation of suffering that originated elsewhere in the lives of ancestors who endured what should not have been endured, who survived what should not have been survived. And the survival is the transmission, is the passing forward of the marks, the scars, the alterations that survival required. And the requirement is what makes the inheritance unavoidable, is what makes the dead still speak, still influence, still shape the living, because the dead are not gone, are not finished, are present in the bodies of descendants, are present in the epigenetics, in the gene expression, in the reactivity, in the vulnerabilities, in all the ways that trauma persists beyond the traumatized, becomes transgenerational, becomes collective, becomes the wound that a people carries, that a lineage inherits, that cannot be healed by individuals alone, but requires collective recognition, collective processing, collective transformation. And the transformation is possible, is happening, is the work of those who recognize the inheritance, who refuse to pass it forward, who do the difficult work of metabolizing historical trauma, of breaking cycles that have persisted for generations, of healing not just themselves, but the lineage, the ancestors, the descendants, the entire chain of transmission. And the breaking is not erasure, is not forgetting, is not denying what happened, but is integrating, is processing, is transforming the raw wound into scar tissue, into wisdom, into the capacity to remember without being destroyed by the remembering. And the remembering is necessary, is what prevents repetition, is what honours the suffering, is what ensures that the dead are not forgotten, that their pain is not invisible, that their legacy is not silence but speech, is not erasure but presence, is not void but the acknowledgement that they still matter, still shape, still influence, still speak through the bodies of the living, through the inherited patterns, through the transgenerational transmission of trauma that makes history not past but present, not finished but ongoing, not ended but continuing in the lives of descendants who carry forward the marks, the wounds, the biological memory of what was done. And what was done cannot be undone, but can be transformed, can be metabolized, can be released from its hold on the future, can be prevented from transmitting further. And the prevention is the work, is the healing, is the breaking of cycles that cannot break themselves, that require consciousness, require intention, require the difficult recognition that the pain being felt is not just personal, but is inherited, is collective, is historical, and that healing it requires more than individual therapy, requires acknowledgement, requires witnessing, requires the collective processing of collective trauma, and the processing is happening, is the work of communities, of peoples, of lineages who are recognizing the inheritance, who are naming the trauma, who are bringing into consciousness what was unconscious, into language what was biological, into the examined what was automatic. And the examination is what allows transformation, what allows the cycle to end, what allows descendants to live without the burden, to inherit not trauma but resilience, not wound but wisdom, not pain but the capacity to bear pain without being destroyed by it. And the bearing is what breaks the cycle, is what ends the transmission, is what allows the dead finally to rest, to stop speaking through symptoms, through suffering, through the bodies of the living, and to become instead memory, story, history, the acknowledged past that shapes but does not determine, that influences but does not control, that matters but does not trap. And the trap is what trauma creates, is the cycle that repeats, is the inheritance that persists until it is seen, until it is named, until it is brought into the light where it can be examined, can be understood, can be transformed from curse into legacy, from burden into gift, from wound into wisdom. And the wisdom is what can be passed forward, is what can be inherited, is what can replace the trauma in the transgenerational transmission. And the replacement is possible, is happening, is the work of healing that extends across time, that heals not just the present, but the past, not just the self, but the lineage, not just the individual, but the collective. And the collective is what trauma targets, what trauma fragments, what trauma destroys. And the collective is what healing restores, what processing rebuilds, what transformation makes possible again, the sense of belonging, of continuity, of connection across generations. And the connection is what makes the inheritance bearable, is what converts trauma into meaning, suffering into purpose, pain into the possibility of preventing further pain. And the prevention is the inheritance that can replace trauma, is the legacy that can break cycles, is what the dead want, have always wanted, which is not to haunt but to rest, not to burden but to bless, not to wound but to protect. And the protection comes through the metabolization of their trauma, through the breaking of the cycles they could not break, through the healing they could not achieve, and achieving it now, in the present, heals not just the future, but the past, heals the ancestors whose suffering is still active, still present, still transmitting, and the healing stops the transmission, releases them, releases the descendants, releases everyone from the cycle, from the inheritance, from the weight of pain that has travelled too far, lasted too long, harmed too many, and can finally end, can finally be transformed, can finally become not trauma but memory, not wound but scar, not curse but the story of survival, of endurance, of the refusal to let trauma be the final word. And the final word is healing, is transformation, is the breaking of cycles that seemed unbreakable, the ending of inheritances that seemed inevitable, the release from the past that makes the future possible, makes life livable, makes descendants free to be themselves, rather than the repositories of ancestral pain. And the freedom is the gift, is what healing makes possible, is what the work achieves, is the inheritance that can replace trauma, the legacy that can be passed forward, the blessing that can travel across generations, not as wound but as wisdom, not as pain but as the capacity to transform pain. And the transformation is what matters, is what makes the inheritance of trauma not destiny but opportunity, not curse but challenge, not the end of possibility but the beginning of healing that can reach backward and forward, can touch the dead and the unborn, can break cycles and begin new ones. And the new ones are what the work is for, what the healing aims toward, what makes the difficult metabolization of inherited trauma worth doing, because it frees not just the self, but the lineage, not just the present, but the past and future. And the freeing is what ends the transmission, what stops the cycle, what allows trauma finally to be finished, to be over, to be transformed from the weight that crushes into the wisdom that strengthens. And the strengthening is the inheritance that descendants deserve, is what the work achieves, is what makes the pain of ancestors not meaningless but meaningful, not wasted but transformed, not the end but the beginning of healing that can extend as far into the future as trauma extended into the present. And the extension is what breaks the curse, what ends the haunting, what allows the dead finally to rest and the living finally to be free.